Hello all, welcome to the first CARC plenary session hosted by the data facing track this time. It's kind of a new concept we're testing out. There's a whole bunch of topics that like all the tracks are interested in, such as the results of one of our working groups. So we're playing around with how best to schedule that. I think we're going to try moving them around the different slots that are already blocked off instead of trying to find a random spot. So this is what we're trying. So please give us feedback if this works for you or if you have some other idea. We can use ideas. All right, on your screen right now is a brief slide summarizing our group, CARC, the Campus Research Computing Consortium. If this is your first time, go ahead and check this out. We have a couple, we have the People Network, which is kind of like a seminar series. And we also have working and interest groups that organize around a specific need and actually create deliverables, such as the capabilities model we'll be talking about today. So another announcement, we officially have a code of conduct. There's a nice big link to it in our call doc today. So that is official now, which we're very happy about. We also have subscribable calendars and a Slack space that hopefully we'll be publishing more information about soon with all the links to get access and get all set up. A reminder, we do have a YouTube channel, which is why we're recording today. There's a link to the data facing playlist in the doc. And then I think we'll start a new playlist for these plenary sessions. So keep an eye out for that. And we have topics scheduled out to June already. So I'd like to let you know about what's coming up. On April 6th, we're going to be talking about some digital scholarship platforms, the HathiTrust Research Center, and the Model of Models from the University of Cincinnati. We have data feminism in May. And then in June, we're going to see more of the infrastructure behind the HathiTrust data set that the scholarship platform sits on top of. That should be fascinating because it is somewhat crowdsourced. That's all I'll say about that for right now. So now I'd like to hand it over to Claire and Patrick.
Thanks, Debbie.
I'm going to go ahead and take over the screen, yes. All right, everybody see it?
Looks good, thanks. Hello, everybody. We'd like to thank the Data Facing Track for inviting us to share our work with you today. And we're grateful that this is also being offered as a plenary session for all the tracks to participate. So I'm speaking to you today, Patrick Smits from Semper Cogito, consulting on research IT assessment and strategy for higher ed. He's the co-chair of the CARC working group that supports this capabilities model effort. And I am Claire Mizumoto from the University of California, San Diego, where I lead the research IT team. I co-chair the CARC working group with Patrick, and I'm currently the co-coordinator of the researcher facing track with Bob Freeman, among other CARC activities. And I'm also on the EDUCAUSE RCD Community Group Steering Committee. Next slide, Patrick, thanks. For those of you who are not familiar with RCD, it's research, computing, and data, which includes technology, services, and the people supporting the needs of researchers and research. And it's intended to be a broad, inclusive term covering computing, data, networking, and software. The National Science Foundation, the NSF, uses the term cyber infrastructure, and others use research IT. RCD attempts to be just as inclusive as cyber infrastructure is in the NSF world. The capabilities model is possible because of the partnership among these three organizations. Internet2 seeded the idea and got the discussion going. CARC facilitates the working group that developed the tools and supports the work. And EDUCA's support includes the RCD community group, and they have a team that supports the core data service and helps with expertise in this particular kind of data gathering. Next slide. Thanks. I expect that most of you are familiar with Internet 2 and EDUCAUSE, but here are some additional activities in CARC beyond the People Network track. As Deb indicated on that the opening slide that we all use in the tracks. The professional community is the People Network. Working groups like the capabilities model include professionalization and workforce development working group and the research IT ecosystem working group. Interest groups are a less formal group that may explore topics that could eventually become working groups. Now I'll pass the baton to Patrick to get into the nitty gritty of the capabilities model and the community data set. Patrick?
Thanks, Claire. Some of you have heard some of this before, so I want to give a little bit of background to folks who don't know about the capability model, and then we'll talk about some of what we're learning from the data set we gathered. So have you ever wanted to get a comprehensive view of the support you have for research computing and data? And if you wondered, how do we represent the state of our research computing and data services to our leadership and key stakeholders? Then also, are we missing something? What else should we be paying attention to that we might not have thought of? And then as we think about strategic planning, funding, and hiring, how do we identify and describe areas for improvement and growth? Well, this is why we built the model. It allows institutions to assess their support for computationally and data-intensive research. And as a structured model, it can facilitate discussion among different groups and different roles and service providers, like maybe a research IT team, central IT, and the library. It also can help you identify gaps. Now, the gaps may already be on your radar. You may be entirely aware of some things that you would like to put more energy into, or they may be in areas that you weren't thinking about. The model was developed by a diverse group of institutions with a whole range of support models, different kinds of models at different institutions, in a collaboration, as Claire mentioned, among Internet 2, CARC, and EDUCAUSE. The assessment tool is designed for use by a broad range of institutions, not just R1s. The structured model shared across the community facilitates gathering a valuable data set for understanding the broader trends, as well as to understand patterns among subgroups. For example, to understand the difference between emerging centers and established R1s, or among EPSCoR eligible institutions. For those of you who aren't aware, EPSCoR is a designation the NSF and other funding agencies use for states that get very little research funding and that they're trying to invest more in. We have the community data set from 2020, from last year, and I'll be sharing some of those insights in a little bit. So it's designed for a range of roles and stakeholders. So that includes campus research computing and data practitioners, like many of us are, PIs and research team members, key partners. I mentioned some of the different roles and the service providers. It's really useful to combine these teams in an assessment from central IT, from centers and institutes, and in particular from libraries. And then campus leadership, obviously. And we designed it to be useful across institution types and institutional organizational models. And this last point is key. The model is agnostic about how your institution provides services, and instead emphasizes what researchers have access to. So you might be a largely centralized group, or you might be a very federated group, or you may even be in a system where you get a lot of services from one of your partner institutions. So what is this tool we've been talking about? This is a screenshot that shows one portion of it, and it's fairly dense. But the version 1 prototype of the tool was implemented as a spreadsheet, a Google Sheet, that is enabled collaborative effort as you fill it out, because everybody can be working together in the sheet at once. And it poses a series of questions for you to consider. The answers yield a computed coverage value, where those answers are color-coded to provide a kind of heat map view of your assessment. So if you're doing really well, you'll get green, down through yellow for concern, and red to clearly mark the gaps. And The model itself divides areas of capabilities based upon the concept of facings. And many of you are probably familiar with facings by now, with one tab for each area. So let me take just a quick aside on that. The concept of facings, many of you may know, but some of you may not, it actually came out of an early workshop on professionalization in cyber infrastructure. And they were discussing how to represent the range of roles, and they coined the term facings. At a workshop in December 2018, the original maturity model workshop, we adopted this facings model and saw it as a core organizing principle, and it's since been taken up by a number of other working groups. We think it's an important thing to emphasize that we represent the broad range of different kinds of roles involved, and that's how we structure the different questions. So this slide is a blow up and shows you one of the ways you answer the question. So for example, one of the lenses we consider is that at your institution, how well do you support a given area? So it ranges from no deployment or support up through your tracking use or planning, piloting, and initial deployment to parts of the institution, which is not uncommon. And then if you've really got a well-established service that has equal access across your campus, then you can describe it as deployment institution-wide. Another important lens is the service operating level, which is inspired by some of the ideas from IT service management that ranges from no existing service through it's there, but there's a substantial risk of failure. There's a lights on only mode where you're just barely keeping it going. And then, if you've just got it running along in a basic economy mode, or if you're very well funded and you're always upgrading your service and adding new things, you might be able to describe it as a priority or premium service. So you have these lenses that you answer the different questions on, and those yield then computed values. So this shows both the computed values out for several rows, but also in addition to assessing your current state, the team can mark specific topic areas for attention as a priority, either medium or high priority. And you note it's possible that you have low coverage in an area and you may choose not to make it a priority. That's up to the institution and what you think is important for your researchers. And by the same token, you might have decent coverage on something, but it's an area you really want to excel in. And so you may make that a priority for continued investment and development. So the priorities don't factor into your coverage value. They're simply a tool for marking things as part of your discussions that you want to work on together. So as you complete the survey, a summary sheet automatically rolls up the different areas into a view you can use in discussions with leadership and your key stakeholders and others. There's a bar graph you can grab for reports and presentations. This was requested by members of the community to do summary reports for their leadership. Each facing has a summary coverage value, and then you can drill down one step to see the major themes within that facing, providing some high-level view of your support. This is an example here from the software facing where it calls out the fact that at this hypothetical institution, there's very little coverage in workflow engineering. So that calls out quite highly with the red highlight, and it's a subject for discussion. And then that summary sheet also draws in on those priorities. I mentioned that priority marking feature. Well, the summary sheet pulls those priority marks into the summary as well. And it gathers up the items your teams mark, again, just to make it easier to feed the ideas into strategic planning or to generate a quick report for your leadership. And again, here in software facing, not surprisingly, this institution decided to mark some workflow areas as priorities to think about.
Hi, Patrick. We have a question real quick. Is this a U.S. institution focused model?
So in a sense it is, but in a sense it isn't. There's nothing in here that we think is particularly specific to U.S. institutions. When we gather the demographics, the institutional demographics, we're currently using, among other questions, the Carnegie classification. And that's the one area that our international users have said, well, what do I put there? And some of them are familiar with Carnegie and they know how to say, well, yeah, we're basically an R1 or an R2. We'd like to modify that, and EDUCAUSE is actually working on their institutional demographic module so that their core data survey can be used more widely, and we're working together to think about how we update that. But it's otherwise not particularly US centric. This grant this work was supported by an NSF grant, and obviously they're interested in advancing it in the US, but we're actually working already, as I said, with some international institutions, and we'd like to make sure that we can continue to. So if folks identify things where we're not aware of stuff we should consider, then we'd certainly value that input. It's, I will say much of the feedback we've gotten to date, just because of where we've been able to host workshops and things, has been US institutions and some Canadian institutions. But actually, I'm just about to go to a slide that talks a little bit about that participation. So to date, close to a little over 125 institutions have downloaded the model, which represents 44 states, 2 Canadian provinces, and I just saw a UK institution downloaded it. So we have over half of the R1s in the US have downloaded the model. Not everybody has completed that. Last year we had 41 institutions that completed it, but that also represented over 20% of the R1s, I think. So we also, as you can see from some of the other graphs, that we've got a good mix of Carnegie classifications, public and private and so forth. We're still working harder to get more minority serving institutions represented, and that's part of some ongoing outreach. One of the things you might note is that we ask people, well, what do you intend to do with the model? And here what's interesting is that many people want to use it, most of them want to use it, incorporate it into a strategic planning process, but a lot of them are also really interested in benchmarking, which is where some of the data gathering comes in. Many of them also used it as a basis for thinking about their program and just, well, what are other people doing? So, as I mentioned, one of the things that many institutions want is insight into how they're doing relative to the community and some of their peers. So we created these simple benchmarking reports for people who contributed data that put their institution's results in context. This screenshot gives you an idea of what one of these looks like. And as you can see, it's pretty data dense. There's a lot of data here, so I want to look at a couple of the key points. So if we look at the data facing summary areas, we see in the first column, the percentage coverage values that this institution indicated in their self-assessment. And the tier this is associated with is shown next to it. And that tiering is given the data from the entire community who contributed data. And it's not just what percentage you got, it's what's the distribution of what most institutions said was their coverage in this area. And so tier 1 is the top tier and is highlighted in blue. And you see, for example, the last 2 rows on data policy compliance and sensitive data support. And then you get tier 2 is green, tier 3 yellow, and tier 4, the lowest tier, is in red. In this case, for this institution, it's data discovery and collection. They don't have a lot of coverage. Then the full report shows percentage coverage values for a whole set of subcommunities for you to compare to. But this zooms into several of these subsets and show broadly what tier the community falls in, and then what you would fall in relative to these subcommunities. So if this was a public institution, the first of the 4 columns on the right shows that this institution would be in tier 1 for data security and in tiers 2 and 3 for the other areas. So when we look at the coverage values that you have, if we only thought about other public institutions, that first column in the right image is where do you fall relative to the publics. The second column is if you were a private, where do you fall? And not surprisingly, privates are at a slightly higher level. And so the tiers drop down a little bit if you're comparing yourself to private institutions. And here, for example, you see that data analysis and data viz are in the lowest tiers, and so you might want to have additional attention driven there. On the other hand, if this institution was actually in R2 in the Carnegie classification scheme, they're actually not doing too bad. And you see the last column on the rightmost image would show that you're mostly 1s and 2s and a couple of 3s, although again, the data analysis and data viz, they're still behind a lot of their peers. So that's how the benchmarking visualization works. I hope that gives you some idea. It is a very data dense thing and it merits a lot of close looking, but I wanted to give you some idea of what you can see. So you can see where you fall relative to different sets of peers. So now getting into the data, there were, as we said, 41 institutions completed assessments and contributed them to the 2020 data set. The institutional demographics of the participating institutions are comparable to those for the larger community. So a good mix of publics and privates, a good mix of Carnegie classifications, and so forth. And here's an example of some of the early data from the community data set analysis. Institutions generally do better at system-facing capabilities, strategy and policy and researcher-facing relative to the data and software-facing capabilities. Also, what's important to note and what we saw in the data set, look at those error bars. They're pretty huge. There's a lot of variation among the contributing institutions, showing how much, those are one standard deviation. And so there's a lot of variation among contributing institutions on coverage values. This scatter graph is another way of looking at the variation among the represented institutions. Each vertical slice is one institution. And then across from left to right is the 41 individual institutions. There's a couple of things that really stand out. There's a huge range of coverage across the institutions. They're literally all over the map. The other thing that's worth noting is that only a few institutions have coverage values that are consistent across facings. Most have fairly different levels of coverage in each facing, or at least one facing for which coverage is quite different. And at the same time, there's little commonality to the relative ranking of facing coverage across the institutions. That is, different institutions have strengths and weaknesses in different areas. And this was really striking as we looked across the data. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with that. Groups that are thinking about collaborations can take heart that the odds are they can find a partner institution that will complement their strengths, since it isn't the case that most people are doing well in one area and poorly in another area. So looking here, comparing how public and private institutions assess themselves across these different areas of coverage, we note that the private institutions consistently have higher capabilities coverage than the represented public institutions. This may not surprise folks that much, but it's useful to have real data to actually show this. It's also worth noting that the variation among public institutions is considerably greater than that of the privates. Again, except for the system-facing capabilities, where there's a little bit more consistency, and probably because those are better established areas. There's a longer tradition. But if you look at a couple of them, you'll see like in the researcher-facing area, the single standard deviation is almost twice for publics what it is for privates. So here's another example looking at general areas of the researcher-facing capabilities and grouping by Carnegie classification. So here what we see is that the dark blues are R1s, the middle blues are R2s, and the lightest are everybody else. And perhaps unsurprisingly, R1s have considerably more coverage of staffing, outreach, and advanced support capabilities than R2s. And both groups have higher coverage than the other types of institutions. But looking at capabilities around research lifecycle management, for example, the distinctions are not so clear, and nor is the variance that high. So, you know, it's interesting to dig in and look at the different areas and see where there's divergence and where there isn't. And part of that may be because you're more closely tied to things like grant management and other sorts of compliance issues, which are kind of required if you want to get grant funding, and the other areas aren't as tightly controlled, and so people do them as they can and based upon the resources they have to invest. So here we're looking at EPSCoR and non-EPSCoR states. So there's about, I think it's 22 EPSCoR eligible states, and then the other 28 all are not EPSCoR eligible. What that means is that those states, the EPSCoR states, get less than 0.75% of federal funding from the NSF, of the pool of NSF money. So they really aren't getting a lot of research resources. These states, the graph shows the gap between the institutions in those states compared to the states that get more NSF funding. And while the system side of things is not too different, they find themselves with significantly less capabilities coverage in most other areas. And if we dig into the data facing area, which many of you are interested in, we see that the differences are pretty stark. In particular, when you look at like data discovery, data analysis, data viz, and most striking is for support for security and sensitive data, there's an enormous gap between what the EPSCoR states report they can cover and what the non-EPSCoR states actually have in place. We've been working with a group of EPSCoR states that are building strategies together to address this and to understand what their common problems are and what common strategies might be. And for them, having this data that backs up what has been an impression for them is tremendously useful. So that gives you some idea of what this kind of data can tell us. Last year, we presented our analysis of the 2020 data set in a report that in a publicly available version provides a summary findings for this. And you can see links up there or go to the CARC website. There's also a version provided to contributing institutions that includes more detailed data, as well as the benchmarking reports and access to the underlying data, which has all been anonymized, if they want to do their own data analysis on it. I hope it's given you an idea of how your institutions can use the capabilities model to assess your coverage and how you can think about using the community data set to understand your coverage in the context of the community. Now Claire is going to share an institutional perspective on using the capabilities model.
Thanks, Patrick. As Patrick just described, there's a wide variety in the institutions who submitted their data for the community data set. I'll take just a couple minutes now to describe the approaches from a few of those institutions who completed the model. At each institution, there was some individual who spearheaded the campus's completion of the model, and they almost always had to tackle not only introducing the capabilities model itself, but exactly those things that Patrick described to you, the concept of the actual RCD community, the facings, why it makes sense to use the model as a strategic planning tool. Then the institution had to devise a plan on how to answer the questions and then use the answers going forward. Next slide. So in order to be successful in getting the model completed, each institution had to determine how best to engage their research, computing, and data community. At a few institutions, like Arizona State University, the campus advocate, our very own Doug Genowine, Senior Director of Research Technology, who is spearheading the use of the model, worked through the questions by answering what he could, then providing applicable portions of the model to stakeholders and subject matter experts to answer those questions. At ASU, following the submission of their data, Doug has done presentations to the university leadership on their completed data to highlight the results and to encourage discussion on how to use the data for strategic planning. At my own institution, a small subset of RCD professionals completed the model after I introduced it to a group of researcher-facing professionals and also to our research IT governance group. Patrick and I showed the model to the University of California System-Wide Research IT Committee, which is made up of representatives from campuses in the UC system, including UCLA, Berkeley, and the rest of the 10 campuses, our medical centers, the San Diego Supercomputer Center, and the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. As with any institution, we had to introduce the concepts, terminology, and the possible use of the data. Some of the campuses completed the model, and we're hoping the results will help each campus individually, as well as giving us the opportunity to leverage the entire UC system data collectively for bigger efforts. By no means did I consider this as a one and done activity, but I thought that year one was just the beginning of our conversations. In another case, there was a research institute who had recently done a survey with their researchers. They took advantage of the results of that survey to begin answering parts of the model. After those initial questions, they followed up with interviews and convened regular meetings to work through the rest of the questions in the model. And another approach, there is a higher ed system with multiple schools, including a community college in one EPSCoR state that utilized a consultant to help them through the coordination of their answers. At the same time, one of the national supercomputer centers decided to focus on their internal customers in their first use of completing the data, with the plan to widen their focus in the coming years. So at this point, I might note that it's not just campuses, that supercomputer centers and research institutes are using this model. And one final example, the RCD program at the University of Nevada at Reno took advantage of the small size of their program to conduct one-on-one meetings with facings experts to answer sections of the model. So it's clear there's many ways to complete the model. It's also clear that institutions are motivated to both complete the model for internal use, but also we have groups who are very eager to have access to the community data set to see how they're doing compared to other institutions. We've also heard from several institutions who did not submit their data on time, but are laying the groundwork this year, hoping to submit next year. Next slide. So what's next? We want to continue to share the results in sessions like this one today. We want to develop a version 2.0 on a different platform, not Excel. And we want to expand the community and share experiences so others can join in and benefit from their own results, as well as the experiences and comparison data from other like institutions. We'll do this with activities like office hours and hopefully some other sessions that will allow you to explore the data set, examine and talk with folks from your peer institutions. We're open to making the capabilities model as useful to you all as we can. We have a proposed workshop for PERC 21 on strategic planning based on the RCD capabilities model. And we plan to propose a BOF at PERC for EPSCoR state institutions. So that's our presentation today. Are there any questions?
Thanks, everybody. We know we threw a lot of stuff at you in a short amount of time. So breathe and then let us know what you need to know.
We did have a question about EPSCoR, and we've got the link to the NSF program, but can you kind of give a layman's description of it?
Yeah, so I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but a number of the federal funders use this definition because they recognize that some states are well ahead of others in terms of building out research infrastructure and using that as part of a funded research program. And so what they do is they say they look at the states that get less than 0.75% of the total pool. NSF looks at this independently of NIH, as I understand it. In all those states, then there's some special programs and special funding streams that actually help them to bootstrap their programs and get up to the level where then they are participating more fully in the research enterprise across the country. So that's really what the program is about. It doesn't have a lot of money, but that money goes a long way in these states that are otherwise relatively underfunded. And in the case of what we've been doing with them, they're trying to understand and characterize their common gaps, their common challenges, and what some common strategies might be to address those things, whether it's all following a similar approach or actually doing regional consortia or different things. They're still talking that through. But what they've done, a group of them last year participated and filled it out. There's a bigger group that's going to try to work on the 2021 community data set, and they'll build then an EPSCoR data set that they can use to discuss what their reality is in the first place, and then what do they want to do about it in the second place. So examples of some of the EPSCoR states are Alaska and Maine and Nevada and Montana, and the Dakotas, I think, are in there, and I forget all of them, but there's quite a few. And I think the Virgin Islands, they also include some of the US territories. So the Virgin Islands and Guam are also in there. and a series of others. You can go, if you look up EPSCOR with NSF, you can get a lot more information about it.
So there's a question about some folks want to know if their institution has submitted. You can certainly send a message to us and we can look it up and check for you.
Yeah, we didn't, we're trying to be fairly careful about the data. So we don't list the participating institutions anywhere, in part because we want to make sure that you can't go and re-identify any of the institutions, because even though the data is not that sensitive, people for the most part don't really want to share a hard assessment. In some areas it is a hard assessment, they don't want to share that publicly. So that's why we, in the data sets that we share, we de-identify everything and we don't list the institutions, because we don't want people going and trying to figure out exactly where a given peer is relative to them. But yeah, if you email us, we can let you know. We can point you to the folks that that were involved in it. And if you haven't filled it out, but somebody's downloaded it, we can also point you to them.
Patrick, there's a question about IRB. Did we seek IRB for institution-wide data?
We didn't. We had the discussion, and the conclusion was that the data that we're gathering wasn't covered because there isn't data about any individuals. And the judgment that we got, the call that we got was we didn't need IRB approval.
I helped Michigan Medicine do our assessment, and it's really only asking about the services, so it's all information that people can access anyway.
I'm looking over some of the other comments, just catching up. The version 2 platform that we've designed and architected, we're waiting on trying to get some funding for that. It will be on something like Qualtrics, and that will allow you to have you can generate private reports and then choose to submit it to the community pool or not. I will say that some folks, they did take a local and contributed approach to it, where since it's just a Google Sheet, you can copy it. You can generate a duplicate and you can play with it. And in fact, what some people did is they generated several copies and shared it around because they weren't used to a workflow where everybody actually worked in the same document at once. You can download it as an Excel spreadsheet. We don't recommend that because there's a whole bunch of macros in it and they don't all translate well. And copying the data back is a pain. But you can actually use it as having a private copy. And the way we manage it, there's a special role that there's a capabilities model owner that owns the documents, and we're very careful about who has access to that role. But if you aren't comfortable having anybody else know about it, you just produce a local copy, and then we can't even see it. So, and we describe that process to people in the guide. But up to now, I would say probably 90 to 95% of the institutions that complete it contribute their data. There are very few that don't, and the ones that don't, I think in general, it's because they just sort of lost track of it. In a couple of cases, they came back and said, hey, we wanted to be in the community data set. And I said, oh, well, you checked the box no when we asked you if you wanted to contribute. So we actually went back and asked a lot of folks, and they said, oh yeah, actually we do want to. We find there's very few that don't want to contribute because they want to be able to do the benchmarking reports. Those are really valuable. And they want all the extra data, right? We produce a summary report for everybody, but if you really want to know, how's everybody else doing in these specific areas for these specific questions, you've got to contribute data to get that level of insight into where the community is.
Are there any plans to include some demographic information like student, faculty FTE, RCD FTE, some of the EDUCAUSE core data survey components, cores, storage, network, GPUs,
Yeah,
etc.
really good questions. What the approach we're taking is in coordination with several other efforts. So the core data survey has got all kinds of important information in it. They've deliberately not dug too deep into the research area, and over time we've talked about being a little more explicit in complementing that way. The other thing is that the RCD professionalization working group within CARC is preparing a census of RCD professionals. In fact, they've got their draft survey and they're hoping to release it for all too long. And that is designed specifically to pull out how many people do you have in different kinds of roles. Also, where did those people come from, and how did they come into these roles? We're trying to understand the state of the people and the programs that support research computing and data. So that's a big survey that we see complementary to this. And the main thing that we're doing is collaborating with them to ensure that we have consistent institutional demographics so that we will be able to use the data together in a larger model. And in the 2.0 version of the capabilities model, we plan to have a data portal that will allow you to interactively explore the community data set, assuming you're a contributor, or the public information if you're not one of the contributors. And the idea is that we would have a combined portal, or at least a coordinated portal for that census data. But that's, these are a little bit blue sky at this point. These are ideas that have been discussed among the working groups. That's really where we'd like to go. If you're interested in that stuff, that working group is very active, and they're currently working towards release of that RCD census. And you can go and look at the RCD professionalization working group on the CARC website and learn more about that. There's another thread on that working group as well that a number of us are involved in on studying career arcs to understand how do professionals come into their roles, what are opportunities for advancement within the world of research computing and data support, and also for some folks who want to go elsewhere, what are some of the options to take everything you learn in these roles and go and do other things as well. So that is a new thread of activity in that area, but there's a lot of stuff going on. So.
Hi, this is Ramazan Aygün from Kennesaw State University. Thank you very much for preparing this RCD model. We built it last year, and it was very helpful for us to see our weaknesses and to see where to make those improvements. Now, the next thing that we would like to do is now, we want to make sure that we take steps forward, and but we don't know how. There's for example, are you going to help us on maybe some pairing with good institutions so that we can implement those weaknesses so that we can improve ourselves? So that's what we are looking at the next step right now from our side.
Cool. I mean, that's Claire mentioned that some of what we'd like to do is gather stories and experiences, and that includes both how did you go about doing the assessment, but then as well over time, well, how did people use it? How did it inform a plan? Were they able to leverage it to get additional funding? And then a couple of years later to repeat the assessment and demonstrate your progress and things. And we think sharing those kinds of stories will help a lot. There's some folks who have got a really robust planning and funding effort, and there's others who are just getting started with this. So.
Yeah. My question is, rather than reading the stories is fine, but like consulting type of stuff, could I communicate with someone who does this properly? So that's my main thing.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things there. One, there are folks who consult in this area and can provide some individualized ideas around how you might take approaches. The workshop that we proposed to PERC this summer is much less about the model and much more about approaches to strategic planning and then pursuing a plan to advance in a given area. And that's because we ran workshops the last couple of years on helping people to understand the model. And now we want to really focus on, okay, what do you do with it? What are your next steps? So that workshop might, if we get accepted, it's still in review, that might be a useful place to go and have those discussions and possibly identify some peers or other members of the community that you could work with.
All right, that was very good. Thank you.
I think also our plan to have office hours and utilize that time also to have some of the institutions talk about their process. You might naturally come up with other institutions that you gravitate to because what they talk about is very similar to your situation. So I'm hoping there's a little bit of grassroots efforts as well that will connect people up.
Okay, all right, thank you.
The EPSCoR group is sort of a natural affinity group in that sense. But as Claire mentioned, there's other ways that you might understand the kind of institution you are and who your real peers are. There's a couple of other groups that have come to us and said, hey, can we build a peer group and then get a report for us so that we can see what our commonalities are? And that's something that, again, we're hoping to get some more funding to have a little bit of consulting time underwritten for institutions and to do some special projects like that. Right now, again, you can certainly approach us or approach folks who do consulting in this area to say, hey, how do we look at our data together, kind of thing. And the data is, the data is all available, and if you have your own consents, you can share your data among one another. So you could build a customized peer group data set if you wanted, and then take a look at the results.
Okay, right, thank you.
I see a comment in the chat that you can export the model as an Excel sheet for a local copy, and it's true. As I say, it's a pain to move the data back is all. It's easier just to copy, but if the Google Sheet to a private copy of it. If you really want to have something that's truly offline, then Excel is a better bet. In theory, there's offline drive apps, and your mileage may vary on that. One of the things, going back to one of the earlier questions about knowing whether your institution has contributed, one of the requirements that we put in when we were thinking about what we'd like to have in the 2.0 version was the ability to recognize an institutional authentication using something like In Common, so that if your institution had contributed data, then the owner could allow other people at that institution to get in and look at the results as well. First, we have to get the funding and build the platform, but the hope is it would be easier to figure that stuff out. I think we're close to time. As Claire mentioned, we'll be announcing a new set of office hours. We do these talks. We have help groups that Tom put in. We're happy to answer questions or help you out. Please let us know. And if you come across things where you think, gee, I wish it had this, or I wish it did that, please let us know that as well. Always looking for feedback.
Great. I think if there's no more questions, Deb, should we turn it back to you? Do you guys have some, do you guys want to close?
Nope, I think we covered everything. So Thank you all. See you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.